Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Learning Curve. I am your host, Julia McLeod. Before we begin, please join me in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, enable me to teach with wisdom, for I help to shape the mind. Equip me to teach with truth, for I help to shape the conscience. Encourage me to teach with vision, for I help to shape the future. Empower me to teach with love, for I help to shape the world. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We would like to take a moment to reflect on the events of our history that have led us to gather today for the purpose of learning together. This traditional territory on which we record is of the Indigenous peoples of the Treaty 6 region and the Métis settlements of Métis Nation, Alberta, Regions Zone 2, 3, and 4. We're recording from our brand new studios here at Lumen Christi, our common home in Edmonton Catholic Schools. Today's episode title is Redefining Success through Equitable Assessment. The agenda for the episode begins again with our TSA segment, Tricky Situations in Assessment, with Nicole Lafreniere, our Director of Curriculum and Assessment. In this segment, Nicole will help us navigate and land on solutions to these difficult situations in assessment. Our interview today is with Marielle Poulin, one of our teachers at Mother Margaret Mary High School. She's been doing a lot of work in equitable grading and equitable assessment, and today she'll share with us her insight and her perspective into how we can begin to work within this world of equity in education. We'll then hear from Deputy Superintendent Tim Cusack in his segment, We're Still Doing That. We'll explore outdated assessment practices and solutions to help us move forward. That's the plan for today. Let's jump right in.
Mrs. Lee teaches at a junior high school where some teachers use assessment methods that aren't fair to all students. For example, some teachers only allow students to participate in class discussions if they're confident speakers, while others only give high grades to students who write in a certain style. Mrs. Lee believes that these assessment methods put some students at a disadvantage and don't accurately reflect their abilities. She wants to speak to her colleagues and the administration about using more equitable assessment methods, but she's not sure how to do so without creating tension. What do you advise?
Mrs. Lee is on the right track in terms of thinking about grading equitably. So we want to make sure that when we are grading students, we don't grade teachers, but we grade students. When we're grading our students, we're giving them multiple opportunities to demonstrate their understanding through a variety of different ways, specifically in relation to the outcomes. So she's thinking in a really great and positive way about how students are responding in her class. And she's also looking around at the school and she's thinking, okay, how are our students being graded in relation to those outcomes? But she's also in a tricky position because she can't just go to her next door neighbor and say, hey, you're not being fair. Because if you ask any teacher, they're going to say, I grade fairly. Of course I grade fairly. And that's a difficult thing for her to be able to do. And then if she were to just immediately go to her administrator, that also might come off as a little bit maybe not as positive as she wants it to. I would suggest to Mrs. Lee that she probably should begin in her own classroom. What's one particular area in which she can demonstrate that equity in grading practice? So perhaps it's in questioning, or perhaps it's in looking at content rather than language for her English language learners. So there's a variety of different ways, but then she needs to gather some evidence. What has she changed in her practice that is really making things effective in making sure that her classroom is an equitable place to be and her students are being successful? So she needs to gather that evidence of her practice. Her next step might be to invite her administrator in, or to invite maybe her assessment consultant in to say, hey, I'd like you to come into my classroom and see, I'm really working on this. What do you notice? What can you see as I'm working on this? Can you be my critical friend or my partner on this? She might invite her partner down the hall to say, can you be my critical friend as she's working on it? So at least it's starting some conversation at her site. Once she's taken some of those steps, then I think it's fair to say, administrator principal, I'm working really hard at this, and I've really noticed a few places in our school where maybe we could work towards improving it. Can I share some ideas with you? And maybe we could brainstorm together. One of the things that is an administrator's responsibility is to build leadership capacity in our schools. It's right in the LQS, but also for teachers to take on that leadership role in their schools when they're seeing things that maybe they're not as comfortable with. Those are things that we really want to make sure that we encourage in our teachers. So now go to the principal and say, here's some of the evidence I've seen. I'd love to be able to design a 10 or 15 minute PD that we could do in our staff meeting, so that we can open this conversation and have some dialogue around it. And the principal hopefully will be able to say, yeah, I'd love to be able to support you in that. Here's how it might be successful at our school, because the principal is better positioned to know how other teachers are going to receive that. So it's in that, first of all, looking at your own practice, then inviting others into your practice, and then saying, hey, how can I work with you, principal, to share this more broadly, that Mrs. Lee might see some success.
Welcome, Marielle. It's so wonderful to have you on the show today. We're really lucky to have you here talking about equitable grading, and I think this is a topic in education that we sometimes are worried about approaching, or worried about bringing to the forefront of our practice. But hopefully today we can dive into that a little bit and see maybe what's a path forward in this world.
Yeah, so thank you for having me.
So we'll jump right in. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background, and what brought you into teaching and teaching chemistry in particular?
I grew up in Edmonton. I was born here, still live here. I did my formal schooling with Edmonton Catholic Schools. And in fact, both my parents were both teachers with Edmonton Catholic. As a young child, the dream was always to be a teacher. As a teenager, I fell in love with science, specifically chemistry and physics subjects in high school. And so I pursued a degree in science. I kind of ended up doing environmental physical science. Just, the wonder of how the world works and everything really caught my attention. Thinking to be a scientist or to do research. And after I finished my degree, thinking about where I saw myself, what I saw myself doing, I think the love of learning and just sharing that love with others is what drew me into education. I taught, with many districts. I did distance learning. I ended up also working and volunteering with the provincial jail system, which, seeing that, and that really, because I've lived a pretty privileged life, saw the injustices firsthand of, the people that were in the prison system. And that really did leave an imprint on me. And I think, with the pandemic was a bit of a catalyst into this world of equity and assessment. Yeah. And then the chemistry, back with Edmonton Catholic, that's my wheelhouse. I was fortunate enough to kind of land back with that position. So yeah, that's where I find myself today.
Yeah, that's quite a diverse background in education, and I think seeing those different perspectives from in classroom experience to online learning to in our jail systems, that's really a lens that you're bringing to the table for us today.
Yeah.
So we're gonna go to our next question. Can you tell us a little bit about what is equitable grading, and why is it important in today's society?
I started out, by finding a few books about it, but in thinking and preparing for, this conversation, I kind of looked at the two words separately. So we hear a lot about equity versus equality in education. Equality being more about treating everybody equal and having the same for everybody, whereas equity is more about, justice, acknowledging our biases, acknowledging imbalances that exist in our society and our education systems and our schools, and then adjusting our practice with that. And then if you look at the word assess, the original etymology comes from the Latin to sit or to settle. And it was originally used for settling value on property for taxes. And education kind of uses it, I think, in a similar way, where we are settling or, sitting with value on a student's performance or a student's work. And so if you think of the two words together, it almost seems like an oxymoron, because can you, without bias, settle on the value of a student's work? Can you do that with acknowledging the imbalances, or is that something that we just kind of work towards? So I don't know. I think I live in the tension of, can those be reconciled together? Can they exist? Or is it just something we can work towards continually, acknowledging the imbalances that there are?
Yeah, I hear in that, recognizing that we're human, and education is a social experience.
Mhm.
Our students are human, we're human, and we're all coming to the table with biases. So what can we do as educators to, one, recognize that we have and we hold these biases, and maybe step two would be, in what ways can we work towards sheltering our students from those biases, or we were talking earlier,
Yeah.
and you said acknowledging that with our students.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if, because I think we have sheltered them. We've had the idea that assessment is objective. We work with trying to, a lot of the education system has been trying to make assessment objective, and I have done or read certain things where, what if we lived in a space where we just acknowledged the subjectivity of it and the beauty of that subjectivity, and bring our students into that conversation where it is a conversation to assess value to someone's work. It should never be just a top-down type of a thing. Like, I think our students need to be part of that conversation, and I think that's how I've tried to bring equity into my grading. Is it's a sense of community, and the students need to be a part of that as well.
Yeah, I think you're segueing perfectly into our next question. For our listeners who may be unfamiliar with equitable grading, what's an entry point suggestion you have for them to get started? Can you walk us through how to do it?
I think where I started was with theory. A lot of teachers, we get our last and only educational theory is we discuss in our undergraduate degree. And I think once we start teaching, we get kind of sucked into the whole practice, the day-to-day classroom management, lesson planning, assessing and grading, and all of that. And we forget about the theories that are behind our practice. I don't think you can separate the two. I think that theory drives practice, and then the practice that we do reflects our theory. So, I really encourage teachers to just look at the reasons why, almost ask themselves some tough questions about their ideas about learning, their ideas about assessment. How do I think about learning? So, like, if I see learning as a linear process, as, I'm taking students from point A to point B, that's going to be reflected in how I assess my students. If I look at assessment as more of like a fractal, so there's a couple of educational theorists at the University of Calgary, Sumara and Davis, who talked about just there is no linear. It's not linear. Learning has many entry points. It has no end point. And if we think about learning as more in an ecosystem or a fractal with no beginning and no end, it does affect how we assess and how we think about assessment in our classrooms. And then there is like a new, I've read new theories about ecological. You hear the ecological education, and that's, it's tied very much into the Indigenous ways of knowing. So our education systems are built on Western ways of knowing. And especially in my context of science education, it's all Western science, which has really disconnected the knowledge and the way of knowing from the people, from the community, from the land. And so, I've really been learning from my Indigenous Métis colleagues about how can we get back to community. We cannot exist without. We don't exist alone, I think, is what it is. And I think that's our education system needs to better reflect that.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a great point of teachers engaging in reflective practice.
Right. Yeah.
So taking that time to reflect on who you are and what your actions are in the classroom, and I think that's a point of consideration we can definitely take from that response.
And I think like Edmonton Catholic Schools, with this whole process of learning and assessment and the work that the consultants are doing, even being exposed to new practice might be a gateway or open up new theories of learning and new theories of assessing. That sometimes teachers, we just don't have time, right, to do all of that reading and learning as we did in our undergraduate degrees.
Yeah. Well, our next question is, how does equitable grading impact learning, both for students and for their teachers? And then have you seen any significant changes in the learning of your students?
So I think the biggest change, working with those new ideas of learning and new ideas of assessment, was creating a different classroom environment. So I think every teacher, every group of students you have is a completely different experience. I can say that, last semester I had 3 Chem 30 classes, and each one of them was just so different. Even though the content was the same, just the experience in the room was a bit different. So I think the learning, kids learn best when they feel safe, when they feel valued. And so if you create that kind of a learning environment, they're more likely to take risks. I know there's a lot of research going into when students feel safe, they'll take more risks, they have more success. I've kind of seen, there's 2 types of students who benefit from this type of like more equitable or aiming towards equitable education. And I think one of them is the student who hasn't succeeded in our traditional education system. They haven't really learned to play the game of education. So they've failed classes, or, a lot of them think that they're dumb or they're not smart. And I saw a lot of that working in the prison system. They're kind of the ones that you would say fall through the cracks of our education system. And I have noticed that with the classroom environment of more equity and, placing value on the students as humans, they begin to see the possibilities. So even if they aren't mastering every single outcome of the course or of the program of studies, they do feel that this is a potential that they could maybe in the future look back at it, or they can apply that confidence into other subjects that maybe they love more or like enjoy more than, say, chemistry, for example. And then the other group of students that's been interesting to see the change in their learning is the students that are successful, that have learned to play the game of education and get the good grades. They're much more leery about these new grading practices that I've tried to, that have evolved over the last few years in my classes. They're worried about their, post-secondary entrance, which is a very valid concern because it's part of the system we currently find ourselves in. But, with encouragement, and it's about trust. So, I'll always tell the students, just, you kind of have to trust me. We'll get to know each other through this. And if there's ever any concerns, just to let me know that I do have their back for this entrance exam. But I find that, there's a lot of other research about top A performing students take less risks in life. They'll pick the courses in post-secondary that they have less chance of failing. Mm-hmm. So they will continue that, not taking risks through their whole life. So this opportunity to try harder questions, because there is no risk of lowering their percentage. It enables them to maybe dive into questions that they hadn't thought about since they were young. A lot of high school students, they're so excited and curious in elementary, and a lot of high school students or teachers will say when they come to us, they've lost a lot of that curiosity, just because they've been so bogged down with the grading and the step-by-step process to get to university. So those parents also, I've seen a big change with them, because they give me a lot of questions about how is this going to work. So yeah, but learning of the outcomes, I think it's just they're just more comfortable. It's a more safe environment.
Yeah, I'm going to put you on the spot for a
Yeah.
little bit. I think our listeners would be interested in knowing how do you communicate this type of grading practice, a more equitable grading practice, to your families?
So I start the semester with a course outline, and my course outline has kind of changed over the years. I incorporate as much information on that course outline for the students and the parents. And with the students, the first day of classes is a big conversation about how the grading is going to work, how their quizzes, and I'm almost trying to go away from the word quizzes because it's almost like they have a reaction, right, to that word. So we could call them learning tasks, or we call them other things, where it isn't one shot. They don't need to know or master an outcome on their first quiz, right? They don't need to master the outcome at the end of a unit. They really have the whole course to be able to get to as close to mastery as possible. And so that's kind of what I communicate. And then with the parents, it was very important that I had the support of my admin before I started on this practice. So, not that I did a pitch, but I kind of, I got myself really organized, had all the information, could back it up with literature, and just kind of told my admin, I kind of want to experiment. So I send home an email to all of the parents, most teachers send home welcome introduction to the course emails, but mine kind of dives into, this is going to be a little bit different. It looks a little different. If you have any questions, just let me know. And I do get a lot of questions. They start with questions at the beginning of the semester, and by the end of the semester, they're usually thanking me for just the difference in assessment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. I think that's it showcases that we already have these communication structures to be able to try and like you said, experiment with our assessment practices in our schools.
Right. I mean, we are a community, right? And so we need to bring in all of the pieces of who our students are. And family is a big part of that. And the school community is also a big part of that. So, yeah.
Yeah.
What? We're still doing that? Oh, come on. Deducting 10% off of the mark for every day that an assignment is late? That's as old school as I am. But that was sadly a practice that we did back in my day. And it was more of looking at a behavior a student was doing of not having met a deadline. And so really no value in assessment practice whatsoever. So if Timmy's assignment is 4 days late, there's 40% off. And at some point, it's that diminishing scale of return of why bother? If I'm 5 or 6 days late, it's not worth doing anymore. So the value of the learning is lost. And what it did really was create animosity and hard feelings, typically between the teacher and student. And we know that building relationships is the absolutely critical part of moving students along in their learning. And so I'm glad we're not doing that anymore. We don't ever want to look at that behavior in terms of assessment. We want to know what the student knows, understands, and can do. And so really minimizing that impact is critical. We want students to demonstrate what they know. And sometimes we have to understand the circumstances surrounding why an assignment might be late. That's the conversation. That's building those trustful relationships with our students to understand how do we encourage them to get that assignment in, to sit down with them, to get that out, to tease the learning out of them so that we can see visibly where their learning is and how we can best support it. So no more 10% deductions. Over to you. What do you think is helpful?
So another, question that I think teachers need to sit with or hold tension with is, are my assessment policies actually behavior policies? So if I'm not allowing late work, is that an assessment policy or is that a behavior policy? I think sometimes the two get confused. We can't, or not that we can't, I don't know if should is also maybe the right word, but whether we should be assessing behavior is, kind of a reflection of a certain theory of learning as well. But, late work, zeros, assigning a 0 for something that isn't handed in is not assessing the content. It's not assessing an outcome. It's just assessing the behavior of that student and attaching a grade to the behavior. Most educators that are working with equitable assessment would say that that's not an appropriate way to assess. We need to, even though you can't separate the value of a student's work with the value of the student, that they intrinsically have that attachment naturally, that if I don't do well on something, it's a reflection of me as a person. I think you can tell the students or try to communicate with the students that we're trying to assess your understanding of a certain outcome, not your ability to hand something in on a certain date. We can encourage students. We're working with students, that are young. They aren't adults. And I think adults have freedom. We have freedom to move deadlines. We have freedom to move collaboratively with other people. I think we need to afford students that same freedom. So I would really just make sure, or even just look at your assessment policy and see if it's actually maybe a behavior policy instead.
In this whole work in equitable grading, have you ever been challenged by other educators?
I haven't been challenged outright, but there is a lot of conversations that I kind of overhear about when you allow a student to redo an assessment or to have another attempt at an assessment, that it just ends up the students have an inflated grade. I think that idea of grade inflation is kind of tied to the idea of deficit thinking, in terms of thinking our students from a deficit perspective. So this student can't do this, or they can't be in my class for whatever reason. Equitable educators or educators striving for equity would say that, and I think universal design as well, and inclusion, that every student has an opportunity to succeed. How we encourage or how we allow that transformation to take place is what we're trying to do without, the grade inflation is a misnomer. If, as an educator, if I have 100% of my students pass a class, is that grade inflation, or is it that I've actually provided the opportunity for them all? It stems back to the idea of standardized, the idea of normal. You think of a bell curve, even in the problem is also in higher education as well. Am I striving to get a certain percentage of the class in a 50 to 60%? So I'm only allowed to have a certain percentage of the class to get 80 to 100. That I think stems from the problem of standardization. Who's decided on the standard? Who is decided on what is normal in education, or what is normal in assessment, or even what is normal within a student? And that, I think the inclusion, education, universal design for learning has really started to kind of like chip into that whole deficit understanding of our students.
What are some challenges you've faced when implementing equitable grading, and how have you worked to overcome them?
I think some of the challenges are, there's just so many different theories of learning, and you can look past at how the theories of learning and assessment have evolved over the decades, over the centuries of formal education. And so in our school buildings, there are many different theories. Each teacher has their own theory of learning that they're, and it's reflected in their assessment. And as teachers, we struggle with, one of the researchers I've read recently is Mark Winschittel, and he talks about 4 teaching dilemmas. So as a teacher, we have these 4 dilemmas that are constantly kind of in our peripheral vision, or they kind of, I don't know how to say, but they're just always there. And so in any situation, we have to worry about the concepts that we're trying to teach. So the conceptual understanding, just even of the knowledge of our subject area. Then we also have the pedagogical. So if I want my students to understand something, what's the best way for me to approach that content, for me to approach that outcome? We also have, the political. We live in a province that still has standardized testing. We have some schools where they have to give the same assessments for every subject. So those also are challenges and dilemmas that a teacher faces. The other challenge is it's very difficult to grade equitably. Like I'll say it is, I find I have hope in the community that I've found, of like-minded teachers and educators and admin. But it is, I'm not going to lie, it is exhausting. And even, Winchell talks about a lot of teachers that are moving towards progressive or constructivist teaching practices are at a much higher risk of burnout. So, and I think that's where the support is really needed. So I think that's for me, the biggest challenge is that those dilemmas, the risk of burnout, because we're not set up to teach that way right now. Our systems are pretty traditional. It's, and it's a lot, I wouldn't want to say easier to teach in a traditional way, because I think teaching is just really difficult in our context, not post-pandemic, but still living in a pandemic. And I think that's the challenge. The challenge is just the context of, yeah.
You did talk about glimmers of hope with those communities of like-minded educators that you've found. Can you speak a bit more to what you've found to kind of help you overcome that one challenge of burnout and time?
Right. ECSD, I have found like-minded colleagues in my school that, we've had communities of practice where we can meet over an issue or a question and kind of contemplate that and run ideas off of each other. So that has been super helpful. And social media is as bad as it can be. I have found just an amazing community on Twitter. Even coming back to teaching chemistry and physics, I found, I would say, master teachers of these subjects all over the world. I've had the fortunate opportunity to participate in professional development courses with people on formative assessment from all over the world, book clubs, where you meet with just, educators that even in our context, when we find our context to be challenging, they are all finding the same thing. It is kind of a universal challenge of teachers to to be everything for everybody is very challenging.
Yeah, I'm hearing community come back.
Yeah.
Right? Community in our classroom, but also community as educators, and collaborative professional learning here is key. Let's build some collective efficacy together.
Yeah, I often feel, I think teachers too will say they feel lonely when they're just in their classroom. That is the love of a teacher, is to be in their classroom with their students. But I think professionally, pedagogically, that is lonely because you're not bouncing any ideas. So, honestly, meeting Jennifer and working with her for the last 3 years of just, I'm going to try this and then let's work together. And then that didn't work. So let's try something else. And with the support of my admin, that's really just allowed me to experiment. I can say as a science teacher, I experiment every day with my pedagogy. Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm so happy that you're finding that community within Edmonton Catholic Schools and outside of us and beyond. Yeah. So our last question for today is, for those who may be interested in trying out some equitable grading practices, where do you suggest they start?
I think the first thing, honestly, is to read and just read and read. I know it's hard with the day-to-day to find the time to do that. So even if you just read one article or find one blog of an educator who works towards equity or humanizing education, that can really help. And it kind of just it opens up new ideas that you might not have seen. I think the other thing is to seek out like-minded. Don't be shy. If I find even just someone's course website, and I think that they have fabulous assessments or lesson plans or just a way of doing it, I reach out to them and just, can I not borrow, can I have your stuff? Can I use your stuff in my classroom? I have had people reach out to me, even just on the, Alberta Teachers Facebook. I get messages. I've never taught Chem 30, can you help me? And so there's been a few Southern Alberta teachers that I've been working with for the last few years, just encouraging change. And then I think find one new practice or one new strategy at a time. You can't change overnight. I think that one change is overwhelming enough. So if you want to start with, say, like the 2-stage exam, that's one thing. You kind of develop it, you work with it, and then it opens up the door to other possibilities. And then just try one. Like, I think I try one new thing every semester. So I think this semester, I'm working with self-assessment. So I'm trying to have the students, a certain percentage of their grade will be self-assessed. I think they're pretty worried and apprehensive about it, but I've been encouraging them, and they've been working through trying to get a sense of what they know and what they don't know, and how they can bridge that kind of a gap. And so we'll see how that one works out. Last semester, I tried another new thing about mind maps. We can often separate our outcomes in our program of studies as just like one outcome to the next outcome to the next outcome, but we kind of miss that whole, how are they all linked? How is this whole course it's not linear. It's almost, I don't want to say a circle, but they're all linked together. All of it comes together. And even my subject, how is it linked to social studies? How is it linked to, just so they can see the big picture, be able to transfer what they know from class to class.
Yeah. That strategy of mind maps brings me back to my high school experience. I had a social studies teacher who, I was in a small francophone board up north, and he believed in that strategy of how is everything interconnected. Right. So as a student, I can say that's a strategy that I've enjoyed.
Yeah, sure. and I kind of came back to it in the master's program I'm studying right now. We had a whole, a big chunk, and it's funny because I go back in as a student now, and so I'm being graded. And I think once you remember or go back into that feeling of somebody placing value on your own work, it also, you have a little bit more sympathy for how the students feel. Mm-hmm. And I try to tell my students, I say, yeah, grades don't, it's not the beginning and the end. It's not what really matters. The mattering is and then I can tell them, yeah, but I'm worried about my essay or my paper that I've just submitted. So it is a learning process for all of us. I think but I think that's part of the fun, is we might never get there, but I think if we work together, we can make it better for our students and even for each other as educators, I think.
Yeah, one small step at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you again for being here with us today. I think we've gained a ton of insight into what is equitable grading and how we can kind of start thinking on moving forward in this practice. And I want to give you another shout out. If our listeners are looking for strategies in action, they can check out your Stage 2 exams video on our YouTube page.
Right.
And I'll have that linked in the description of the podcast as well.
Yeah, and anyone's welcome to just shoot me an email or a chat on Teams, whatever it is. I love discussing theory and pedagogy and practice. So, perfect. Yeah, the more the merrier.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much again, Marielle.
Thank you for having me.
We're now at the end of the episode. I would like to thank Marielle again for her knowledge in equitable assessment and grading practices, and for sharing those challenges, but also those successes, so that we may ourselves consider how we may move forward into creating a more inclusive and equitable environment in the classroom for all of our students. Thank you again to both Nicole Lafreniere and Tim Cusack for their segments. And last but not least, to you, our listeners, thank you for tuning in to all of our episodes here on The Learning Curve. Just a reminder, we'll be releasing episodes bi-weekly, with each episode featuring different voices and perspectives in education. Please like and subscribe to this channel to stay up to date with each release. In the meantime, follow us on Instagram at ECSD Learning, our YouTube channel at ECSD Learning 7786, and check out our many resources on our SharePoint site, bit.ly/assessment-ECSD. All 3 links are in the episode description. And lastly, we want to hear from you. both on Spotify and on Instagram. We're inviting you to share your classroom experiences with assessment. We will feature our listeners in the conclusion of each episode. So help us celebrate you. That's our time. See you next episode on The Learning Curve.